Hey everyone, Azim here. We are starting Chapter 9, Articulations. This is still part of the skeletal system. We've talked about bone tissue and cartilage. We've talked about the different bones of the axial skeleton and appendicular skeleton. What we're going to talk about now are how those bones meet. Where two bones meet, or at least two bones meet, that's called an articulation, another fancy word for the word joint. So yeah, let's take a look at articulations or joints. We'll be distinguishing between many different types of joints. New words that we're introducing here: synostotic, amphiarthrotic, diathrotic. We'll look at the differences between these. We'll also look at specifically a synovial joint and the different movements that are possible. Your textbook goes into a lot of detail about different joint types. We'll be categorizing joints based on what they're made of and also how much they move. We're not going to talk about things like biaxial, monaxial, ball and socket. I mean, we'll mention that certain things can move in certain ways, but we're not going to use those terms. So just a heads up. What will be important is naming joints by their technical names. Just like we've learned very technical names for body regions, I want you to know very technical names for joints. So instead of saying elbow, we're going to say humeroradial ulnar. Instead of saying shoulder, we're going to say glenohumeral or acromioclavicular, because those are two different joints in the shoulder region. We're going to specify these joints by their names, by which bones and bone features are articulating, that they're bordering. So when you think of joints, one way to think of them is not by human joints, but by joints that we see in everyday life. So if we have this monitor here, we can swivel this monitor, we can move it up and down, we can rotate it. This is a highly movable monitor. If we have a highly movable joint in our bodies, we have a word for that. The word for that is diarthrotic, or it's a diarthrosis. Diarthrotic is the adjective, diarthrosis is the noun. If you look at this money clip, this metal part of the money clip, it's slightly movable. You want it to move just enough so you can slip your money in there, but you want it to not move much. It shouldn't swivel all the way open, otherwise you're going to lose your money. So this is a slightly movable joint. And we have joints in our body that we don't want to move that much, but we want to move a little bit. The term for slightly movable joints is a amphiarthrotic joint. It's an amphiarthrosis. Finally, there are some joints that you don't want to move at all. If you look at this woodworking joint, you can see that they're putting the two pieces of wood together and it's going to fit in really, really snug so that it is very, very stable and does not move pretty much at all. I kind of want to wait to the end of this clip because it's really satisfying for me. I forget what this type of Japanese wood joinery is called, but it's very satisfying to watch. Almost there. That. Anyways, this is a non-movable joint. It's almost there. The term in our bodies where we have a non-movable joint, there it goes. It's called a Synostosis or synostotic joint. Diathrosis, Amphiarthrosis, and Synostosis. That's going to be one way we're going to categorize these joints. There's going to be another way we're going to categorize them based on what they're made of. They're not made of wood, metal, and plastic. They're made of things that our bodies can produce and put out. So once again, the definition of articulation, the joint, is wherever two or more bones meet. Now, when I say they meet, it doesn't mean they're physically connected to each other. Like, it doesn't mean they're touching each other, I should say. It doesn't necessarily mean they're touching each other. It could mean they're touching each other, could be in direct contact, but they could be separated by things like dense regular connective tissue or cartilage or synovial fluid. Pictured here is a very generic looking joint. I guess it's supposed to represent, I'm sorry, this isn't the generic one. This is the elbow. There's another generic one later. So we're looking at the right elbow. You can see the olecranon region. Here's the olecranon process of the ulna. Here's the trochlea of the humerus. And then there's a space in between. And that space in between has synovial fluid. It's a joint capsule. So this is one type of joint, one type of articulation where you have fluid in between. Not every joint has that. At joints like these, where there is fluid, you do get movement. We'll see other joints where you get slight movement, and then some joints where you get no movement at all. But there's at least two bones coming close to one another, and there might be connective tissue or fluid in between them. Let's focus on those non-movable joints first. Remember, the term for a non-movable joint is a synarthrosis. Let's break that word down. Syn means together. Syn, like synthesis or symphony, S-Y-N or S-Y-M, that means together. Arthro means joint. So it's a joint that's come together, a synarthrosis. It does not move much. When you have a joint that comes together tightly, it won't move much, like that woodworking joint we saw. We have these joints in places where we want lots of protection for organs. So in your skull, in your thoracic cage, specifically your sternum, your teeth, lots of places where we don't want a lot of movement. In our, the word synarthrosis is a category of joints in terms of movement. Below this, what I'm going to highlight in pink, these are joint category names in terms of what they're made of. So a suture is a type of synarthrosis. A suture does not move much, but the word suture is referring to what it's made of. A suture is made of ligaments, short sutural ligaments. And if you recall what ligaments are made of, remember ligaments are made of dense, regular connective tissue. Tiny, tiny ligaments connect your bones and hold them tightly together. We see this a lot in our skull, both in our cranial bones, between our cranial bones, excuse me, and between your facial bones. We have sutural ligaments in our cranium. Not a lot of movement should be happening here. If you get hit, should be holding tight. Well, the only one movable part of our cranial region is this jaw joint, which we'll get to. So a suture made of ligaments is a synarthrosis. A gomphosis, this is a fun word, gomphosis, PH is a F sound. Gomphosis is specifically between your teeth and your maxilla or mandible, because that's the only place where you find your teeth. Very short ligaments, once again, dense regular, connecting your teeth to your maxilla if it's in the upper jaw, or mandible if it's a lower jaw. You don't want your teeth to move. If they are loose and you're an adult, that's an issue. And remember the term for the socket of our maxilla and mandible, that's called an alveolus, plural alveoli. Tiny, tiny little ligaments holding your tooth down. So those are two examples of synarthrosis. There are two more. A synostosis. A synostosis is an example of a synarthrosis. These words start sounding very similar, so we have to really think about what they mean. Syn, once again, means together. Os, remember os? Os means bone. So it's bones coming together. It's bone-to-bone fusion. It's a bony fusion. Bone is fusing with bone. If you recall, I mentioned this specifically regarding the frontal suture, not the other sutures. This frontal suture is not actually a true suture. It's actually a synostosis. because the frontal bone used to be two bones and it fused into one. Remember when we learned about bone growth, when we learned about osteogenesis? Is that the word I use? Ossification. Remember when we learned about ossification? When we had epiphyseal plates, you have basically three separate bones on a long bone. You got the epiphysis, diaphysis, and epiphysis, and then the plates within the metaphysis, which are cartilage. But then eventually, as your bones grew and grew, the cartilage went away and your bones fused together to form a single bone. That epiphyseal line is evidence of bone-to-bone fusion. That is a synostosis. Other examples of fusion of bones, like the frontal suture, the ilium, ischium, and pubis, that forms your hip bone, otherwise known as your coxal bone. And then I have these 1, 2, 3, 4 more examples that I've underlined here that I've left blank. Pause and think for a second. What other bones have we learned that have fused together to form a single bone? It might be just 2 bones fusing together to form one, might be 5 bones fusing together to form one. Take a second. All right. What else have fused together to form a single bone? The sternum, the manubrium, body, and xiphoid process, those 3 fuse together to form one. The sacrum. Sacrum used to be about 5 vertebrae that fuses together. The coccyx used to be 2 to 3 vertebrae that fuse together. And one more, it's actually in your face. We had the frontal bone already, that fuses together. The other one is down here, that forms that cleft chin. It's your mandible. So, funny writing there. Lots of different places where we have synarthroses. These are some prime examples. Your last 4th example of a synarthrosis. Remember, synarthrosis means a joint that does not move much because you want them to be secure. And all these bones that I've mentioned, you want them to be nice and secure to protect, you want them for protection usually. The last one here is a synchondrosis. Syn means together, chondro means cartilage. I guess it's right there. Chondro means cartilage. So it's bone to cartilage. A synchondrosis is bone to cartilage. We've seen this once again with our epiphyseal plate. So the epiphyseal plate when you're younger, which is obviously temporary if you're going to get older, epiphyseal plate is a synchondrosis that matures into a synostosis, and it shouldn't move much or at all because it's there to support. Another example, a very unique example, is your first rib between your sternum and the cartilage. Just the first rib, not the others. We'll see what the others are, they move more. The first rib is very strong, like a nice and solid ring that goes around your neck, forming with your sternum and your vertebra in the back on the posterior side. The rib one to sternocostal joint, that is a synchondrosis. So we have synchondroses, synostoses, gomphoses, and sutures. Those are all examples of joints that do not move much at all. Those are synarthroses. They're there to protect organs, whether it's something in your head or in your chest usually, or for long bones. Our second type in terms of movement is an amphiarthrosis. Amphi means 2 ways. So in my opinion, this is not the best name for it. I would have gone with whatever root word means slight, but amphi means 2 ways. Like if you're amphibious or ambidextrous, ambi and amphi means you can do one or the other. It's not quite movable, but it's not quite immovable. Yeah, it's somewhere in between, but it's very, very slight. Limited movement in very high stress areas, basically areas where we find fibrocartilage. Not all places, but many places. The two prime examples are the pubic symphysis, as well as your intervertebral discs. The intervertebral discs are between the bodies of your vertebrae. They're between the bodies of the vertebrae. They're not between the superior and inferior articular facets. So not here. We'll get to those later. The part that doesn't move much, the one that supports a lot of weight, is here, not here. Where I'm putting the X's, these are the highly movable parts between the vertebrae. We'll get to that coming up. So symphyses, I don't know if I introduced that word yet. A symphysis is where you have fibrocartilage pads supporting lots of weight and you only have slight movement, not much movement. A symphysis. So the pubic symphysis is one, intervertebral discs are a symphysis, that's another. Slide 8. Another example of an amphiarthrosis is a syndesmosis. Syn means together. Desmo also means together. It means to like link and to attach. We've seen desmo like with desmosomes. This is involving a sheet of ligament. So it's not just like a nice round cylindrical ligament. It's a wide, broad sheet connecting two bones at least, known as an interosseous membrane. Since it's a ligament, remember what that's made of? Ligaments are made of dense regular. And there's some important places where we have syndesmoses to have limited movement. Between your radius and ulna, that's what's pictured here. So in your antebrachial region, your forearm, between your tibia and fibula, you have a syndesmosis. And the distal tibiofibular joint is also closer and tight and does not move much. I guess this is better seen right there. So you have broad sheets between those two bones, and those two bones are unique in our arms and our legs. You want them to be held together. You might be thinking you can turn your forearm over, you can pronate and supinate your antebrachial region. Those joints, those highly movable joints, are different. We'll get to those in a minute. But the one, if we're talking about the sheets holding the two bones together, those are syndesmoses. Now, when you think of a joint, you probably think of a diarthrosis. A diarthrosis is where we have a wide range of movement. I have a lot of examples here, a lot of going on, so let's go over this one by one. First, before I go on talking about a diarthrosis, let me recap what we've just seen. We've seen how amphiarthroses could have cartilage or dense regular. Synarthroses could be bone to bone, could be bone to hyaline cartilage, could be bone and ligaments, dense regular. What's very unique about diarthroses, these highly movable joints, is that they don't have the things that we just mentioned per se, but what they always will have is synovial membrane and synovial fluid. Synovial membranes, remember we learned about that in chapter 4? Synovial membranes, which provide lubrication with its slippery fluid, are found at diarthrotic joints, which makes sense. You need lubrication if you're going to be moving at a spot a lot. If I'm moving my wrist, moving my elbow, moving my shoulder, you want lubrication as the bones move across each other. You don't want that rubbing together. That will cause damage. That's very painful. No fun. So for all of these, there's no other category here. All diarthrotic joints are synovial. Synovial joints are diarthrotic. Diathrosis is talking about how much it moves. Synovial is talking about what it's made of. They're just referring to different things about the same joint. So let's go over some prime examples of synovial joints. And we have a full list in the chapter study guide. I mentioned how rib 1 is amphiarthrotic. Ribs 2 through 7, sternocostal, so here on the anterior side. And then ribs 2 through 12, costovertebral, the ones on the posterior side. Those are synovial diarthrotic joints. You want them to move. You want your rib cage to expand as you breathe in and relax as you breathe out. Fancy name for your elbow. That's the humeroradial ulnar joint. It's the joint between your humerus, your radius, and your ulnar. Humeroradial ulnar. For pronating and supinating, those are your radial ulnar joints, because it's rotating radius over ulnar. To flex and extend your wrist and your knuckles, your wrist is intercarpal and carpometacarpal. Intercarpal, because remember there was two rows of carpal bones, proximal and distal. So intercarpal. Carpometacarpal is between your carpals and your metacarpals. Carpometacarpal. Move your wrist. Metacarpophalangeal is this one. It's the bigger knuckles, these bigger knuckles. That's metacarpophalangeal. And then interphalangeal, that's my lazy way of referring to the rest of them, because I'm not going to name every single one. I mean, you could, but that's going to take a long time. So we'll just refer to the rest of your knuckles as your interphalangeal joints. It's between the middle, or between the proximal, middle, and distal phalanges. I said that for your vertebrae, between the bodies, that's an amphiarthrosis. The intervertebral discs are the amphiarthrosis. But the movable part of your vertebrae, because you can clearly move your vertebrae a lot, the movable part of your vertebrae are between the superior and inferior articular facets. Let me write that down. Between superior and inferior articular facets. This is known as your zygapophyseal joint. Zygo, remember zygote means to link together, or zygomatic, linking together. You're linking together your vertebrae here. That's why it has that word zygo, the zygopo. You can call it a Z joint, one of the few times I'll let you abbreviate. These zygapophyseal joints, these Z joints, those are the movable joints of a vertebrae, not the ones of the body. To nod your head, yes, no. I mean, this is a bit extreme what they're showing here, but to go like that, that's your atlanto-occipital joint between your atlas and your occipital condyles. I'm not sure, I guess it's a Greek thing why you go from atlas to atlanto, but that's what it's called. And then to rotate your head between your atlas and axis, that's your atlanto-axial joint. Your knee is between three bones. It's between your tibia, your patella, and your femur. So this is your tibio-patellofemoral joint. You might see it listed as different things. We're going to go with this name, tibio-patellofemoral. When you say shoulder, what you're probably referring to is your glenohumeral joint between the glenoid fossa of your scapula and the head of the humerus. That's probably what you mean by shoulder joint, the one where you can rotate. But you can also shrug and protract and retract That's your acromioclavicular joint between the clavicle and the acromion process of your scapula. So two different joints in close proximity. They're completely separate. Your hip joint between your acetabulum of your coxal bone and the head of the femur, that's the femoral acetabular joint. And then your ankle is between your tibia, your fibula, and the talus of the tarsal bones. So it's between three bones. Both the tibia and fibula are in the crural region, so we can call this the talocrural joint, between the talus and the bones of the crural region, talocrural. We were going to get practice with all these joint names and what movements they allow, but I would like you to know these, or you should know these. I just wouldn't like you, but you should. So we're going to get more practice, and in the next videos, we're going to learn more about synovial joints. So please look out for that. Yeah, thanks for watching. Please let me know if you have questions. Leave questions in the comments and the discussions.